December 7th, 1982 marked the start of the great video game crash. Only thing was, only a few people knew about it at the time. That day, Warner Communications, which had purchased Atari in 1976, announced their quarterly earnings. Such a ritual was a regular occurrence for any publicly traded company, and Warner was no exception. Analysts, those who hadn't been paying attention, expected Warner to show continued massive growth, powered largely by the performance of their Atari division. Earnings were expected to have increased by 50%, an astronomical number. This made sense. After all, in 1981, 30 million video games were sold, and 60 million would be sold in 1982. With the vast majority of those games being sold on the Atari, it only made sense that Warner and Atari would continue to see explosive growth. Instead, Warner dropped a bomb. Earnings had increased by a mere 10 to 15%, wildly missing estimates. That may not seem like a big deal, but it confirmed what a few had suspected for some time. The video game market was not the engine that would never stop turning. Instead, it was a ticking time bomb. The fuse had already been lit. Now the crash was coming. The market reacted accordingly. Warner Communications' stock price lost one-third of its value. By the end of the next quarter, Warner's profits fell again, this time by 56%. Atari and Intellivision, which controlled 80% of the home console's $2 billion market, were in deep, deep trouble. December 7th would ultimately serve as a historical parallel between the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. It was the symbolic beginning of a major economic shock, even though the causes of that shock had been marching on for months, if not years. The 1983 video game crash shook the industry to its core. It destroyed billions in profits, restructured the entire sector, and set the stage for many of the video game industry business models that we know today. To some extent, I honestly think you can argue it was a good thing. The crash forced quality improvements, weeded out bad actors, and ensured that video game developers invested more into their games. At the same time, it created conditions which nearly killed the industry, at least in the United States. Today's video is going to be a little bit different than usual. I don't think you can briefly cover the crash of 1983 and do it justice. As such, we're going to take our time and go really, really in depth into what caused this disaster, what it actually looked like, and what its long-term ramifications were. I also want to talk about a few aspects of the 83 crash that I think are under-discussed. When recovery actually took place, what that recovery looked like, and where the crash never happened. We'll start at the only place we can. Pong. Home entertainment changed forever in September 1982 when Magnavox, an electronics giant at the time, released the Magnavox Odyssey. The machine was designed by Ralph Baer, a video game pioneer. As you can imagine, the system did not come even close to what we currently enjoy, and this goes well beyond graphics and games. The system was only capable of displaying 3 dots and a line. In fact, it was so primitive that a plastic overlay had to be slapped onto a television in order to create additional immersion. Other items, like paper and currency, would be included with the systems, thus allowing players to keep score of their games, since the system itself was not capable of doing so. The controller is barely recognizable to us today, consisting of 3 kind of weird knobs. The system also had no game cartridges, instead selling game cards that alter the game circuitry and allowed for games to be played. Before its 1975 discontinuation, the Odyssey would sell 350,000 units. It was a commercial success. A new industry had been born. The Odyssey may have been the first, but it was not the last, and other systems would quickly follow, thus creating what we now know as the first generation of home console systems. These systems included TV Tennis Electro Tennis, the Sears and Atari Home Pong series, the Coleco Telstar, and the Color TV game series, made by a little-known Japanese company called Nintendo. Many of these systems had extremely basic graphics and were capable of only displaying 2 colors, often just black and white. Furthermore, most had only built-in games, meaning that one system was capable of only playing 1 or a few games. This helps explain why there were 14 versions of the Coleco Telstar, all of which came with integrated games. Now, the Odyssey was first, but it wasn't even close to the most successful of the first generation of systems. The Coleco Telstar series, all 14 models, sold over 1 million units combined, and Nintendo's Color TV series sold over 3 million. Clearly, home console developers had found a new market, and new systems would continue to create profitable opportunities for developers. Continuing advances made more and more technologically advanced systems available. The second generation of video games brought even more innovation. These systems included classics like the Fairchild Channel F, the Bally Astrocade, Magnavox Odyssey 2, Intellivision, and of course, the Atari 2600. It goes without saying that the 2600 was the most successful of all of these consoles, selling more than 30 million units and 120 million cartridges on over 500 games. Atari, of course, is the company that really accelerated the home console market. It was founded in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, originally to create arcade games. Two of their first games were Computer Space, the first ever commercially available arcade game, and, of course, Pong. In 1975, Atari would begin development on the Atari Video Computer System, which would eventually be renamed the Atari 2600. That system hit the market in 1979, but not before Bushnell, realizing that he needed more capital and business expertise, sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. Atari continued to see enormous, rapid growth. By 1980, Atari had become the fastest growing company of all time. Bushnell would remain company CEO, but clashes with Warner started right away, as Warner began to take the company in directions that Bushnell didn't like. Cultural clashes. Even more impactful was Bushnell's frustrations over the creative direction of the company. Bushnell wanted to see the pinball division of Atari innovate into new specialty tables, and he wanted to see the company abandon the 2600 and create a new system, arguing that the market for the 2600 had become saturated. Instead, Warner closed down Atari's pinball division and redoubled their efforts to sell the 2600. Upset with the direction of the company, and with less of a stake in its day-to-day affairs, Bushnell's attention began to wander. He bought a mansion and started racing boats. He began implementing new business ideas, including a combination of pizza and arcade restaurants. That would eventually become Chuck E. Cheese. Upset by Nolan's erratic business decisions and attempts to undermine their business, Bushnell was fired by Warner. Replacing him would be Ray Kassar, who originally was brought in as a consultant by Warner to figure out how to make Atari more profitable. We'll come back to him later. All of this led to a remarkably successful period for Atari, and what would turn out to be the most successful the company would ever be. History would prove Bushnell wrong, and then right. When he left in 1978, the Atari VCS had not, by any stretch, seen the end of its run. Far from it. Millions continued to sell. Atari did launch the 5200 in 1982, rebranding the VCS as the Atari 2600 in order to better distinguish the brand. However, the Atari 5200 was only a marginal technical improvement over the 2600, and as released, the 5200 was incompatible with 2600 games. This meant that many consumers didn't have an incentive to invest in the 5200, and many stuck with the 2600. Atari was now confusing the market. They had two systems, and competition was rising. Even before the release of the 5200, Atari had to face back threats from the Fairchild Channel F, the Bally Astrocade, a new Magnavox Odyssey, the Mattel Intellivision, and the ColecoVision. These consoles would all sell millions and force Atari into newer, deeper competition. Such was the state of the home console market at the end of 1982 when Atari's profits fell and the crash formally began. Like all economic tsunamis, the video game crash of 1983 was multifaceted. It was layered in with the newness of the industry, a slew of horrendous business practices, and straight-up greed that consumers eventually refused to fund. It was also the result of years of bad decisions, combined with an industry that didn't want to regulate itself. In short, no one factor is overwhelmingly to blame for this crash. Several are. And all of these factors, interrelated, took down the video game industry in 1983. Let's start with some of the more obvious reasons for the crash. Among the most, there were too many systems on the market, and more than the consumer was willing to support. Let's say it's January 1983, and you finally drag your mom to Toys R Us to get the video game system you've been screaming about wanting for months. Which one are you going to get? Yeah. In 1983, you had options. As noted above, 5 systems at the time would sell more than 1 million units. The Atari 2600, the Mattel Intellivision, the ColecoVision, Magnavox Odyssey 2, and Atari 5200. Now, that's not a bad thing. I mean, yay capitalism. The bigger challenge, there wasn't enough variety among the various options. All of the controllers operated in basically the same way. The CPUs were all 1.79 and 2 megahertz. They either had 64 or 128 bits of memory. The color palette was usually 8 to 16 colors. In short, all of the games looked and played the same, and you could get the same game for multiple systems. Things got even worse when you calculated the amount of games that were available on multiple systems. Of the Atari 5200's 69 games, many, including its best hits like Space Invaders, were available on the Atari 2600. And don't even get me started on the amount of games available across every system. Wanted to play Centipede, Galaxian, or Frogger? You could play any of these games on the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, the ColecoVision, or the Intellivision. The oversaturation of games and lack of differentiation between them was reflective of a greater problem within the industry. Too much choice, and too little investment in the quality of games or systems. To be clear, that's kind of mean. I mean, the industry was in its infancy, and the technology wasn't available to support the kind of games that we have today, or even that we had 20 or 30 years ago. However, think of the video game market now. There's Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox. All of these systems have competitive advantages and disadvantages, but they also have brand characteristics and loyalty. The massive systems challenged bottom lines and confused customers. Indeed, this plethora of systems led to a second problem. The companies that produced these games couldn't make a profit, particularly with the business model that had developed for video games. Remember, games and consoles were sold on a modified razor blade model. Make less money on the consoles in order to make real money on the games. However, there was so much competition and so much market saturation that it became impossible to make a profit by selling games. In 1982, games sold for $25 on average, but by 1983, as a result of increasing competition, that price dropped to $18. Consoles were expensive to manufacture. In 1982, the Atari 2600 cost $40 to manufacture and was sold at $125. The Atari 5200 cost $50 to make and was sold at a whopping $269. The Intellivision and ColecoVision probably cost between $50 and $60 to manufacture, while the Intellivision was sold at $250 and the ColecoVision $175. Thankfully, games were relatively cheap and where companies tended to make higher profit margins. However, that also required two things: selling games in volume and dominating the market. The sheer number of third-party developers, more on that later, combined with the number of consoles, made making massive profits on selling games impossible. As such, there was a lack of profitability in this area, despite massive growth. Competition and saturation proved to be a deadly mix for companies like Atari, Magnavox, and Mattel. The profit crash of Atari in late 1982 may have been nuclear-level bad for the industry, but it was far from the only bomb to drop. All of the major players suffered during this time. In the first quarter of 1983, Mattel posted a $20.4 million loss, with the loss directly attributable to an operating loss of $34.4 million in their electronics division. This would mark the beginning of the end for Mattel and their electronics business. The Intellivision 2 never caught on, the Intellivision 3 was canceled, and Mattel sold the Intellivision in February 1984. Magnavox, which was struggling with the Odyssey 2, would completely leave the video games industry as a result of the crash. Coleco would report a profit loss of $7.4 million in 1983, but that loss would balloon to $79.8 million in 1984, and they exited the market in 1985. Game developers also suffered. During this period, Activision lost between $3 and $5 million over a 3-month period. Bally, one of the leading arcade manufacturers, saw profits crash by 95%. All of this created a vicious cycle. Companies suddenly realized that they couldn't make money off of video games and began to reduce their investment or straight up pull out of the home console market. Toy retailers, suddenly aware that the industry was dying, began to reduce shelf space or stop selling video games as a whole. Then the media began to pick up on this lack of profitability and run stories on it, thus creating even less incentive for customers to buy into an industry that may not be around in the future. And so, a vicious cycle was created. Further feeding into this frenzy was more than just the console makers themselves. It was the third-party developers that realized that there were ways that they could make a real profit off of the development of these games. Indeed, third-party developers were among the biggest drivers of the video game crash of 1983, which is more than a bit ironic. These developers first rose on the scene to make better games, treat developers better, and break away from some of the most regrettable business and personnel practices of the video game giants in the industry. Third-party developers first rose to prominence thanks to, you guessed it, Atari. Atari was famous for their bad treatment of developers. Developers were paid badly, rushed, and not credited in games. In fact, that lack of credit led to what many regarded as the first true Easter egg: the hiding of his name in the game Adventure by Atari developer Warren Robinette. Atari's treatment of their developers had always been questionable, but those challenges accelerated under the leadership of CEO Ray Kassar. Kassar had always been a bit of an odd fit in a company like Atari, which was relatively freewheeling and casual before its sale to Warner Communications. Kassar, brought in by Warner, had previously founded his own textile industry before being hired by Warner in February 1978. He served as president of Warner's consumer division until a dispute between Nolan Bushnell and Warner resulted in Bushnell's firing from the company he created. Kassar became Atari's CEO in November 1978. For a time, Kassar would be wildly successful and would oversee the company during its fastest period of growth. Atari's profits moved from $75 million in 1977 to more than $2.2 billion in 1980. Though Kassar would dispute these reports, his poor treatment of developers was extremely well known. In a 1979 interview with the San Jose Mercury News, Kassar referred to developers as, quote, high-string prima donnas. Within days of the interviews, Atari programmers showed up to work in shirts that said, you guessed it, quote, just another high-string prima donna. Kassar refused to share royalties with the developers or pay them more than a set low salary. Programmer David Crane came to realize that the games he made generated $20 million in sales, but he was only paid $20,000 a year. Crane and others would ask Kassar for a royalty rate, but Crane says that Kassar told him, quote, "You are no more important to that game than the guy in the assembly line who puts it together." Kassar's management style was described by those still there, or those who left, as autocratic. InfoWorld magazine reported that Kassar used, quote, "threats, intimidation, and bullying," end quote, to get games developed. All of this meant that many Atari employees, developers, and executives left the company. Disgusted with Atari's treatment of developers and wanting to stay in the industry that they had helped create, four former Atari developers had a better idea. David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead left Atari and founded a new company, Activision. Their vision was to create games for the Atari, and at the time, that vision was revolutionary. After all, the video game industry was brand new, and third-party platforms really didn't exist. Using attorneys and connections within the industry, they were able to acquire $1 million in venture capital, more on the role of venture capital later, and start their own business. Activision was born and began to publicly advertise proposed games as soon as 1980. Atari was less than pleased with the possibility of third parties recruiting away developers and publishing games to their system, seeing the rise of third parties as a threat to their business model. They sued, alleging that the four men stole trade secrets and violated non-disclosure agreements. The lawsuit would drag on for 2 years before being settled. Activision agreed to pay royalties on sales, but would continue to make games for the system. This settlement was critical to the development of software development houses. They could come to agreements with home console manufacturers and sell products. With the third-party model now legally established, the race was on. More reputable development houses began to appear. However, so did less reputable ones. Atari now had third-party developers, but there was a major problem. They had no control over who could develop games for their system. There was no lockout chip, and no one was reviewing what types of games were on the system. As a result, horrendous low-quality games began to appear. For example, there was Chuck the Chase Wagon, a promotion for Chuck Wagon brand of dog food. It's a maze-like game, in other words, a game that tried to take advantage of the popularity of Pac-Man, in which you're a dog trying to get Chuck Wagon food. There was also Tax Avoiders, in which you do whatever is happening here. And don't even get me started on the god-awful adult games like Custer's Revenge, which simulates you raping a Native American woman who's tied to a pole. Regardless of the quality level, there were just too many games. In January 1983, there were 400 games. Many were licensed from some other media property. As correctly noted by Bill Kunkel, an executive with Electronic Games magazine, quote, "They've licensed everything that walks, crawls, or tunnels beneath the earth. What are you going to do? Present a game with a root canal?" Furthermore, even games that were good had problems differentiating themselves. How many maze chase or space shooter games did you really need? As noted by Kenneth Bosworth, president of International Resource Development, quote, "The ability to come up with a new game is crucial. Most of these games are kind of boring, and people get sick of them pretty fast." With no control over the games appearing on their system, quality suffered, and with no way of stopping developers from creating bad games, Atari's reputation took a massive hit with consumers. And by 1982, they started to buy less. I want to circle back to one of the issues that I don't think gets enough attention when we discuss the crash of 1983, the role of venture capital. Venture capital is critical for technological development and a huge part of the greater technological and business ecosystem. In many ways, venture capital has made the video game market possible. Their investments in startup companies, including Atari, Activision, and Electronic Arts, paved the way for the establishment, expansion, and success of video games. Venture capital is one of those obtuse technical phrases. It often gets immediately portrayed with images of financial vultures, greedy capitalists who want to take over great companies from brilliant innovators. Obviously, there's a grain of truth there, but it doesn't tell nearly the whole story. Indeed, venture capital has done the world of tech a lot of good. Venture capital firms invest in startup technological companies, giving them seed money. These dollars are often used to hire staff, expand, or purchase new equipment, thus doing all the things that are necessary for a small company to get up and running. In exchange for their investment, venture capital firms will purchase equity in the company, meaning that they now own a piece of it. They may also help the firm in the form of technological expertise or providing board members. Of course, in exchange for their investment, investors receive a healthy profit. Right, the profit motive. That doesn't always mean that businesses have the purest of intentions. The early 1980s were a gold rush for video games. For example, in 1982, Atari had an operating profit of $1.7 billion, profit that had developed as a result of their success with the 2600 system and subsequent games. However, Atari wasn't the only one making a small fortune during this time. For example, in the fourth quarter of 1982, Coleco, maker of the ColecoVision, generated a net income of $7.7 million, 5 times their net income from the previous year, thanks largely to the ColecoVision. Mattel saw their profits for the third quarter of 1982 rise 39.4%, driven largely by sales of the Intellivision. All of this clearly indicates that profits were to be had. Venture capitalists, I'm assuming with cartoon dollar signs in their eyes, began to invest in video games whenever they sensed profit opportunities. That included third-party development houses. Let's return to the game list for the Atari 2600. There were 523 games by the time the system stopped being produced, but only 100 were produced by Atari. Dozens of third-party developers got involved in the production of these games. Some, like Activision, 20th Century Fox, or Imagic, were produced by experienced programmers and created high-quality games. Others not so much. Venture capital played a role in the founding and expansion of many third-party developers, fueling the growth of 158 different game publishers by late 1982. However, venture capitalists only saw profit, not quality. The industry was new, and there was a lack of understanding about what it meant to have experienced game designers, programmers, and popular concepts in an already oversaturated market. As a result, venture capitalists helped fuel a boom of developers who simply produced low-quality games that further tanked the industry. Let's return to one of the biggest drivers of the success and failure of the video games industry, Atari. Indeed, the crash was so closely tied to Atari that in Japan it was simply known as Atari Shock. As noted above, the company became incredibly popular and profitable. That profitability was short term, but I think it's worth understanding why. Clearly, poor treatment of developers, the ultimate creative talent that drove the success of games, played a role. So did a lack of desire to innovate, resulting in a sequel to the hit 2600, the 5200, that was so similar that it's still considered part of the second generation of systems. However, Atari made a series of other blunders that ultimately cost them their place as leaders in the home console market. Atari's dominance was so complete over the market. The Atari 2600 sold 4 times as many systems as every other console in its generation combined, that its failures were enough to nuke the entire industry. We've extensively covered many of Atari's failures, including poor treatment of staff, a lack of innovation, and an inability to differentiate themselves in an already oversaturated market, but we would be remiss if we didn't also concentrate on some of their worst games. This list includes games that were incomprehensible due to graphical issues, being totally buggy, or otherwise unplayable. 3D tic-tac-toe was awkward and had a computer opponent that took a million years to move. Flag capture had atrocious controls and graphics, which, even for the time, kind of made you want to die. Starship, one of the original games to the system, really captures the vast emptiness of space, and not much else. Atari was producing so many games that they even released a video game version of the Rubik's Cube. Atari wasn't helped by the fact that the company was top-heavy and bloated. As noted by Steve Race in The Ultimate History of Video Games, quote, "We had 24 and 26-year-old MBAs running around making multi-million-dollar decisions." Other arrogant business decisions during the 1980s didn't help. For example, Atari began to require that companies sell their already existing inventory, even if that was of a lower quality game, to receive new orders. Even worse, in 1981, Atari began to require realtors to place 1982 orders. As a result, when games didn't move, retailers were stuck with massive amounts of unsold inventory, meaning that their shelves were full and products weren't moving. This made retailers much less likely to buy any video game in the future, something Nintendo would see when they tried to enter the US market in 1985. Atari thought that they were staring in the face of exponential growth potential. By 1981, only 4% of US households had a video game system, meaning that there was still the potential for major growth. What Atari failed to realize was that said growth was not inevitable and could only happen if the company made correct business decisions. The bloated company stumbled their way through the mid to late 80s. By 1983, Ray Kassar was out as CEO, resigning both due to performance issues and a scandal in which it had been determined that he had sold 5,000 shares of Warner stock just before the profit miss of 1982. That stock sale resulted in an investigation by the United States Security and Exchange Commission, and Kassar would return the profits from that sale without ever acknowledging guilt or innocence. Indeed, perhaps this explains why Atari did nothing to regulate poor third-party developer games. They did nothing to stop some of their own worst games, and the market responded accordingly. In 1981, Atari had 75% of the cartridge business. By 1982, that number had dropped to 40%. Another one of Atari's major sins, and worthy of its own exploration, was the credibility gaps in the games that they ultimately created. Two of their biggest games, Pac-Man and E.T., were also their worst. Both of these games were infamous for how bad they were, although they were still the best-selling and eighth best-selling game in the console's history. We covered the Pac-Man game extensively, link in the description, and the E.T. game has been covered ad nauseum by others. While their stories are complex, both suffered from similar fates. Taking a popular product, licensing it, rushing it, promoting the hell out of it through wildly inaccurate advertisements, and hoping that it would all work out. While both games made short-term profits, in the long run, E.T. and Pac-Man created a monstrous credibility gap among consumers. Atari was promising the world and delivering this. Of course, as exaggerate. They always exaggerate. But this was a bridge too far for consumers. Not helping matters was some of the stunningly bad business decisions that Atari made while making these games. In May 1982, Atari produced 12 million copies of Pac-Man, despite the fact that there were only 10 million copies of the Atari 2600 sold at the time, meaning that Atari thought that everyone who owned an Atari would buy one copy, and that the game would increase sales of the system 20%. The game was a commercial success, but not by that much. E.T., whose development was famously rushed into a period of no more than a few months, suffered from boring and buggy gameplay. Ray Kassar blamed the disaster on pressure from Warner CEO Steve Ross, who allegedly promised Steven Spielberg, director and producer of E.T., that the game would be on shelves by Christmas 1982 and that Spielberg would receive a guaranteed $25 million royalty. Aware of the poor quality and stuck with millions of games that would never sell, Atari did the unthinkable. They buried cartridges in a landfill in New Mexico, leading to the creation of what many thought was the ultimate video game urban legend, only for cartridges to be rediscovered decades later. The burial of the cartridges would prove to be an enduring symbol of the excesses and poor decisions of the video game industry and Atari during this time. Finally, it's worth remembering that home consoles were not the only game in town. Personal computers, and their rise in the late 1970s and early 1980s, gave interested consumers a potential alternative to video game consoles, and created alternatives that could, in theory, do more than home consoles. In 1977, the so-called trinity of home computers was released. This included the Apple II, the Commodore PET 2001, and the Tandy Radio Shack TRS Model 1. The prices of these computers vary. For example, in 1983, the Apple II cost $1,395, still very high, although it did come with a ton of features. However, the Commodore PET 2001 dropped to $795, and the Tandy Radio Shack TRS Model 1 was a mere $399. Prices had fallen dramatically over the past few years, and consumers had every reason to believe that the prices of personal computers would continue to fall. Most importantly, computers allowed for a vast range of uses for interested customers. They allowed customers to use word processor software, access third-party programs, and play games. The last part was critical. Hobbyist computer games began to be produced, and professional ports of popular arcade games, including Frogger and Pac-Man, began to appear sometime later. Computer game companies like Infocom and Sierra Online began to publish games that went beyond what home consoles could do at relatively affordable prices. This began to force users to ask a question. Instead of buying an expensive home console, why not just buy a computer game that could do more, potentially expand in the future, and come with better graphics? This actually folded directly into some marketing campaigns. For example, Commodore aggressively targeted home console buyers, offering trade-ins for console systems and noting that college-bound kids would need computers, not video games, to succeed. When the crash hit, it hit hard. 1982 would be the peak year for video game revenue until the 1990s, with revenue breaking more than $42 billion. The immediate effects began to be felt in 1983 when the industry barely broke $37 billion in revenue, a 12% decrease, but not necessarily anything to panic about. The panic would start in 1984 when revenue hit $26 billion. In 1985, revenue dropped another 50%, crashing to $14 billion. It was only in 1986 that revenue began to increase again, hitting $15 billion. It wasn't until 1993 that the revenue would hit $42 billion again. The long-term impacts of the crash were profound on the industry. First, the lack of profitability and total drop in consumer demand drove many companies out from the home console business. As noted earlier, no major console maker made it out unscathed. The crash also impacted third-party developers, many of whom could not survive the massive drop in sales that occurred. For example, Imagic was a major player before the crash. In 1982, the company had a profit of $75 million, driven largely by the success of games like Demon Attack and Atlantis. The company was set to offer an initial public offering on the stock market, only to cancel it the day before they were supposed to go public. They would make their last games in 1984 and go out of business shortly thereafter. Games by Apollo also went out of business. US Games, purchased by Quaker Oats in April 1982, was shut down after less than 18 months. Hamavid, Data Age, American Multiple Industries, and many more companies simply disappeared. Activision laid off workers in 1984 and 1985. Eventually, they only developed games for the personal computer, returning to the home console industry in the late 1980s. Of course, no company suffered as much as Atari. In mid-1983, the company lost $356 million, laid off 3,000 employees, and infamously buried unsold copies of its worst games in a New Mexico landfill. By the end of that year, losses accelerated to $536 million, and Atari would break into two companies, selling its consumer electronics business to Jack Tramiel. Atari would produce other consoles in the 1980s, the Atari 7800 being the most significant effort, but the system sold a mere 3.7 million units. Atari would never return to its former glory. Now, let's be clear, describing the crash of 1983 as worldwide would be false. In fact, in a lot of ways, it was largely limited to the United States. This begs the question, why? Part of the reason is that Japan had access to better systems that were of a higher quality. Nintendo and Sega both released systems in 1983. For Nintendo, it was the Famicom, which Americans know as the Nintendo Entertainment System. For Sega, it was the SG-1000, one of the precursors to the Sega Master System. Both of these systems sold really well, outselling anything else on the market at the time. The SG-1000 and its various versions would sell around 2 million units. Indeed, they were technologically advanced enough that they were considered part of the entirely new third generation of home consoles. The Famicom would sell 6.5 million units by 1986, which was the equivalent of being present in nearly 1 out of every 5 Japanese homes. Similarly, the European game market did not crash in 1983, but the reasons were different. It's actually really simple. There wasn't much of a home console market. Video game home consoles had failed to make a major penetration in Europe, and certainly not in the same way that they did in America or Japan. For example, the Atari 2600 only sold about 450,000 units in West Germany by 1984 and a mere 600,000 units in France by 1989. What was much larger was inexpensive personal computers, which were marketed as being not just good for games, but good for homework and life. Computer games were extremely affordable, meaning that when video game consoles rose in popularity in some places, they didn't in Europe. The impacts of the crash were felt most profoundly by the company that would eventually lead the industry out of the ashes, Nintendo. The 1983 release of the Nintendo Family Computer, aka the Famicom, was a hit in Japan, and Nintendo was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that the product sold well in the United States. However, they ran into many problems, namely in the form of extremely skeptical retailers who didn't want anything that looked like a video game system. Retailers who might have otherwise been interested in the Nintendo balked when they realized it was a home console. They believed in their product, but they had to convince others to do the same. To do that, they revamped the Famicom for American audiences. First, they tried the Advanced Video System, or AVS. This system represented an early attempt by Nintendo to break into the American market. It came with the Famicom and more, including a data recorder, keyboard, joystick, zapper gun, and controllers. The system was redesigned to break away from the traditional video game toy look and instead resemble a sleek, modern electronics device. All of this was a lot, and meant to be not just a home console, like the failed Atari, but an entire home computer unit. The AVS was unveiled at the 1984 Winter Consumer Electronics Show, and it bombed. Salespeople noted that the system did look impressive, but video games were still presumed to be a dead industry. Back to the drawing board. The Famicom was rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, and its design was reconfigured to look more like a high-tech piece of machinery, complete with a gray color scheme and front-loaded cartridge port. Added to this setup was the ROB, or Robotic Operating Buddy, which was used in a select number of games in an attempt to make Nintendo more like a toy and less like a home console. The ROB, though novel and attractive, was slow and awkward to set up. That was fine for Nintendo, which was still looking for distributors and retailers. As IGN would later say, quote, The ROB might have been the key to getting the system into players' hands, and once they had players, Nintendo was convinced that the rest would be easy. Chris Kohler called it, quote, merely a Trojan horse to get the NES systems into American homes. Indeed, even the name of the system is reflective of the stink that still surrounded video games. Nintendo's advertisers warned the company not to refer to the Nintendo as a video game. Instead, it was an entertainment system. And still, Nintendo of America faced major challenges when it came to getting the NES into stores, ultimately going to extreme lengths to do so. Nintendo of America launched the NES in New York in October 1985 to an extremely skeptical audience and business ecosystem that still believed video games meant financial failure. Many retailers refused to carry the device, still associating it with the crash of 1983 and financial misfortune that came with it. To convince a skeptical business community to carry the device, Nintendo engaged in a massive door-to-door sales campaign. They worked with retailers to set up eye-catching displays and in-store demonstrations, allowing consumers to play the games and see the difference between the high-quality Nintendo games and low-quality Atari games. They hired sports stars and engaged in a $5 million marketing campaign. When retailers still balked, Nintendo did something almost unheard of. They offered a risk-free money-back guarantee. Nintendo would give full refunds on any unsold inventory, and retailers didn't have to pay for the product for 90 days. This, combined with the legwork that Nintendo engaged in to sell the systems, ultimately paid off. Nintendos began to move in New York. Next, Nintendo of America moved to Los Angeles, where their efforts paid off again thanks to positive receptions in New York. Other markets, including Chicago and San Francisco, soon followed. By the end of 1986, the system was available across the nation. It sold 3 million units that year and was on its way to mass success. Once it was up and running, Nintendo realized that they had to avoid suffering from Atari's fate. Third-party companies could, no doubt, be a massive asset to Nintendo, capable of releasing additional high-quality games and making the system more money. However, things had to go right for this to work for Nintendo. More importantly, Nintendo had to protect their brand. In order to do that, Nintendo developed an extremely strict licensing system. Third parties could apply for licenses and enter into a contract with Nintendo. These contracts came with a series of restrictions that would have seemed laughable during the Atari era. Companies had to sign a contract and profit-sharing agreement with Nintendo. They had to manufacture their games with Nintendo and buy cartridges from Nintendo, and Nintendo got to say how many cartridges they would make. All games had to be approved by Nintendo, which had a strict series of standards, including limited violence and limits on certain controversial themes like sex or religion. And developers were limited to 5 games per year, ensuring that quickly developed shovelware would be limited. Nintendo's popularity was so huge that companies had no choice but to agree. The first third-party developer for the Nintendo would be Konami. Dozens of others, and eventually hundreds, would follow. Nintendo was not the only video game company that unveiled some sort of quality control program. For example, Sega used its own version of the 10NES, the Nintendo Lockout chip, in the form of the Trademark Security System. Officially approved games would have a string of code that would allow the game to boot up. Unapproved games wouldn't. As such, Sega maintained control over the games that made it onto their system. These strong quality control measures meant that third-party developers could no longer make bad games as quickly as they were able. Instead, they had to make high-quality games, or at least games that met the high standards of the console manufacturer. This change ultimately pushed third-party developers to make better games, enhancing the industry as a whole. The collapse of the home console market created an opening for individuals looking for electronic entertainment options, and home computers filled the breach. By 1983, some computers like the VIC-20 were available for as little as $90, and other Commodore models dropped to $300. More companies entered the fray or expanded their operations. For example, IBM, always popular in the business sector, began producing personal computers. By 1983, the company had sold more than 750,000 PCs. Computers were for work and school, but they were also for play. Computers began to be capable of playing more advanced games, allowing interested consumers to play games on highly versatile systems. Many developers, including Activision and later Electronic Arts, felt that the home console market was dead and shifted exclusively to computers on PCs. During 1985, one of the worst years of the crash, $100 million in video game console revenue was made in the United States. That same year, $110 million was generated from computer games. This period saw games like Qbert, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego, and more. However, by the next year, thanks to the domestic release of the Nintendo, video game revenue would vault back into the lead, with console games generating $210 million in the United States compared to $154 million for computer games. The collapse of Atari and subsequent rise of Nintendo, and later Sega, made it official. Japan, not America, would lead the video game industry going forward. Japanese developers began to rise in importance as well, with many third-party companies, including Taito, Namco, and Enix, making high-quality games that would continue to rise in importance and sales. The impacts of this geographic shift can still be felt today. There are, of course, three companies that basically dominate the home console market: Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo. PlayStation and Nintendo are both Japanese brands, while only the Xbox, made by Microsoft, is American. It's worth noting that the biggest long-term impact of the 1983 crash, the rise of quality controls by home console manufacturers, has largely disappeared. The reason is obvious: the internet. Thanks to the rise of the internet, traditional gatekeepers are dead. Small or individual developers can now create world-class games that can be sold on platforms like Steam or on consoles. Some of these games are legendary. Undertale or Stardew Valley strike me as the most prominent examples, but others, aren't. As of January 2025, more than 89,000 games are available on Steam. In 2024, 18,992 games were released on the platform, but only 4,041 of those games escaped limited status, meaning that they sold enough of these games, the exact number for that is unknown, to be treated as full-fledged games. In other words, almost 80% of all games sold on Steam in 2024 never escaped limited status. That is an astonishingly high number. So, what changed? It's actually the consumer. It goes without saying, video game companies will still do everything they can to separate us from our money. But the internet, including YouTube channels, blogs, and social media, can alert us to shovelware before the game hits the market. E.T. for the Atari 2600 would never be the same commercial success that it was today, because you absolutely would have had 6,000 YouTubers, probably including me if we're being honest, talking about what a terrible game it was. And that's great news. It means that savvy consumers can keep their money and never be tricked by a video game company again. Right? Friends, this was my first shot at making a much longer video, and I really hoped you like it. If you did, I highly encourage you to like, subscribe, or comment, and absolutely click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has served up for you. Thank you so much for watching. This one was a labor of love, and I hope you loved watching it as much as I enjoyed making it. Take care, everybody.